you all already know this, but the kind of the premise for us getting together is that on my book reviewing newsletter book post, Chris Benfey, who I think you should see next to me on the screen, I'm never sure what other people are seeing, um, did with us a reading of my Ántonia, Ántonia. Um, we've done basically for the month of February. Like it took us about a month to get through the whole thing. And we had a lot of conversation about, we did a chapter, a little section of the book every week. And then a bunch of people joined in the comments. Many of them who are here. So we really wanted to actually speak to people in person and kind of bring the conversation to the almost flesh and blood level. And then fortuitously, Ben Taylor, who's a writer I very much like and admire, also published a book about Willa Cather just last fall. So we were able to draw on that in our conversation, and he was willing to come and talk with us too. So what I thought I would do is briefly introduce the two of them and then ask them some very broad opening questions, and then bring in a couple of book post writers who joined us in the chat, and give them a chance to ask their questions or maybe have a comment or something, and then bring in the commenters who joined us in the chat and give them a chance to ask any questions that they have, and then like throw open the floor. So Chris, I've known a long time because we didn't work together at the New York Review of Books, but we both did. At the review, if you look him up under authors, he has a vast and extremely diverse bibliography of critical essays on many marvelous subjects. There's a specialty in 19th century American literature, but has also written about a lot of other things, including a memoir about his family and the arts and crafts movement and kind of itineracy in America. And Ben also has an extremely eclectic bibliography. His last book before the recent one about Willa Cather was a memoir of his friendship with Philip Roth. He's done several, I think two books of writings of Saul Bellow.
Two, yes.
And a memoir of his own. I have a little list of books that we've referred to in the course of our conversation, and I'll add their books to that and make that link available to you at the end in case you want to look up any of these things that we've talked about. So I guess my first question to you two was, why did you, Chris chose my Ántonia as a subject for us, and Ben elected to write, I guess about two and a half years ago, he was telling us, for his next book to be about Cather. And I just wondered if you could tell us briefly why you chose Cather as a subject.
Shall I go first? Well, Cather and I go way, way back to sixth grade, when my teacher, Mrs. Westbrook, suggested I read this. She said, this book is, I usually give this book only to the girls, but as it's told by a boy, I think I'll give it to you. And I don't know what I got out of it. I got out of it what one gets out of growing up books as a kid. Just a few hints of what it's really about. But Cather has been for me what Hemingway or Fitzgerald or Faulkner were for other writers, the standard.
Yeah, I have a similar version of that. Coming to Cather moment. Being a boy, I thought of the 20s and 30s primarily as the era of Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner, the same three. And somebody would want to wedge in Dos Passos or some. I came to Cather in graduate school. I had an Americanist professor who mentioned in passing the interpolated story of Pavel and Peter throwing the bride to the wolves. And he made a big deal of it. And he said it was a sort of iconic story within a story. And I filed that away, and then I began reading Willa Cather, and I never stopped. She's my favorite writer by far. She's not quite of that generation, but somebody publishing in that period. One of the oddities about her, as Ben points out in his biography, is that Cather really finds her voice at age 40. So yeah, it was that vivid tale, which I hope we'll talk a little bit more about. That was what brought me to Cather, the man who threw the bride to the wolves.
Yes, nobody who reads that ever forgets it. Do they throw the husband too, or does he just fall?
Yes, yes.
They throw the husband.
The husband may be first.
The bridegroom and the bride, both.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, one of the many amazing things about the novel is that we have these two just ghastly stories of marriages gone wrong. One at the beginning with Peter and Paul and Peter and Pavel and the wolves, and one at the end with the cutters. And in both cases, the little kids are saying, "Wow, what a great story! Tell it again. Love it."
Yes, these terrible things happen in order to give us the delight of hearing them cast into the form of a story. Yeah,
yeah, well said. That's right.
Yeah, and the kids at the end want to hear about the murder.
Yeah, they're saying the murder, great. Yeah. Let's hear it again. The murder suicide, yeah. What could be more fun?
There was indeed in Red Cloud, there was a murder suicide, very much like the one recounted in the book, and it's all anybody in Red Cloud talked about for years.
Yeah, Cather, this is going beyond your question, but Cather, she was against women committing suicide in her novels. You know, she was very familiar with the great 19th century novels like Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary, and she reviewed Kate Chopin's The Awakening, and she hated it. It's another book, spoiler alert, that ends, as far as we can tell, with a suicide, a woman swimming out where no woman has swum before. And Cather said it's just a Creole Bovary. And when she sort of invites us to think that the novel might end with a suicide, and again, I'm going to ruin the reading for you, the brilliant novel, A Lost Lady, what shall I say? She has another plan.
Ah.
But we have three suicides, right, in My Ántonia, but they're all.
Yes, there's the tramp. There's the tramp. The tramp who dives headfirst into the threshing machine, and the threshing machine never works right.
That's my favorite detail. Exactly. God, it ruined the threshing machine. Yeah, but
no small matter.
Yeah, I described that tramp as a MAGA tramp. He's the guy who says, "What is happening to this country? Now it's the Norwegians. Oh my God." So his last little rant is this anti-immigrant thing, and then he dives into the threshing machine and ruins the machinery.
It's hard to get past that one, but I'm just going to lunge right over it and ask a next question, which is that, I first read My Ántonia because my mother recommended it to me when I was a child. And I kind of associated in my mind with those books of her childhood, like Caddie Woodlawn and, the sorts of books that young women read in the 40s and 50s. And I was just sort of noticing how you drew out her modernity a bit, Chris, but then also these themes, when you read about her life and her kind of friction with Fitzgerald and Hemingway, suggest that she was, anti-modern in a way. Do you feel as though this is all sort of building up to think about why I always feel it's sort of dumb to say that somebody's having a moment or something. That's a kind of a PR-driven observation, but it does seem like she's arising in conversation a little bit more. She felt like a kind of dusty thing from the past, to me at least, for a while, and now feels very current. I mean, one of the people who might join us just wrote an essay about her for this the cultural section of this political newsletter, The Bulwark, and um, she just seems to come up. Do you feel like there's something in the moment that's like kind of reminding us to think about Cather?
I'll
Well, I
invite
don't know
Ben
about
to talk about. I'll invite Ben to talk about her in relation to modernism because he has some very interesting sort of consecutive thoughts about that.
Uh, if you look through the writings of Elizabeth Hardwick or Mary McCarthy, you find no mention of Willa Cather. She was not a figure for them. On the other hand, she was for Catherine Ann Porter and for Eudora Welty and for Alice Munro. So she was always there for some people, but you are right that now seems to be Willa's moment, which coincides with her 150th birthday. Her sesquicentennial is last year.
And fortuitously, the novel's leaving copyright. So we're getting a kind of abundance of new introductions and new reviews and new thinking about them.
Yes, and there can be movies now of these books.
Exactly. Yes. Joy or but yes.
I think that Lost could be a marvelous movie in the right hands.
Yeah. Wasn't there was some sort of version of Oh Pioneers, wasn't there? Some sort of television thing. But anyway.
Yes, there was a TV version of
Yeah.
O'Brien.
Yeah, is it a Cather moment? For me, it's always a Cather moment, but it does seem as though Cather was reclaimed as a feminist writer in the 70s and 80s, and she's always had a large representation in the Norton anthologies. So there is a kind of steady diet of Cather to people taking American lit surveys. And even as people have become a little nervous about or outright hostile towards Hemingway and for other reasons, Faulkner seems increasingly problematic, to use an academic buzzword. Cather has her own vulnerabilities, and cultural historians have taken Cather to task for especially her erasure of Native Americans, using the names of great Native American warriors like Black Hawk and as a substitute for Red Cloud. She's very consistent, but the Indian presence, the indigenous presence in My Ántonia is slight and legendary and of the past, whereas the actual conflicts over land and treaties, bloody conflicts in Nebraska, were a very recent memory when she arrives there, and this wasn't something in the deep past. So, but I think I brought up the MAGA Trump, but the MAGA Tramp. I meant to say. An easy slip. But there is this just glorious treatment of a world of recent immigrants in My Ántonia and in Oh Pioneers. I mean, it's sort of in the title, and in the three lead two of the three lead characters in Oh Pioneers, there really is. And Ben makes the excellent point, I should let him make it, that for Cather, Nebraska was an oddly cosmopolitan world. It's sort of where she discovered old Europe, where she met people who could talk about Vienna and Prague and so on.
Exactly. Yes, it was a polyglot world, and there were more people of exotic origins on the plains than regular Anglo-Saxons. She found herself in the minority. She was surrounded by Swedes, Czechs, some French Canadians, and heard this babble of languages out on the plain. I did want to say a word about Native Americans. The Native Americans who interested her, it's true, were 12th and 13th century Anasazi, not people within living memory.
That's true, though also in Death Comes for the Archbishop, there is a serious and respectably treated native presence
Yes,
as well.
you're absolutely true.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, yes.
So kind of feel like this is very impressionistic of me, but that we're having a moment now where there's a sense of having lost touch with rural America, that the vast expanse of the middle of the country has kind of gotten away, or we don't speak to each other anymore. And there is a way in which this creates an avenue for thinking about that past. I thought a lot about how space, I don't know if Laird is here. Laird Hunt has written had a great section in his recent book of essays called The Wide Terraqueous World, where he visits Red Cloud. And he's himself written all these novels about Indiana. Maybe I'll ask him about this a little bit later, where, the sense of returning to open spaces is kind of the same. Here he is. He's in a hotel, in hotel room in Tucson. Laird, could I ask you about Cather and writing fiction set in the plains? Can you speak from your hotel room?
Can you hear me? I'm on a terrible connection.
Yeah.
You can. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm just in heaven and happy to listen to the brilliant conversation about a writer who has who's been my hero, a writing hero, really since the start. Whose book sat on my rural Indiana grandmother's shelf in her library. Rural erudition is real, and has been for quite a while. Despite it endures actually, despite impressions about that part of the world. But yes, I made a pilgrimage to Red Cloud, and not too long ago, as a just that sense of wanting to be in a place that she evokes in various ways, of course in her work, and also to sort of touch that soil, as someone who has a relationship with a particular state, rural Indiana, and especially the rural part, that is complicated because, like Catherine, part of the reason she was such a hero to me, that's part of her story, right? As already been evoked. She's she's living in New York. She's traveling the world. She's in love with this part of the world where I am right now, the West. And yet she keeps returning at different junctures to that experience in Nebraska. And for me, that was essential because I feel the same draw, even though I've lived in many places. And so just to say, as a practicing writer, she remains much more vivid to me than her company in so many ways. Some of the voices you've evoked, who I have a lot of time for, Faulkner and Hemingway, etc. But nonetheless, it's Cather for me all the way.
Thank you. I'm so glad you could be here.
I want to shout out to Laird. I'm from Indiana too, so the Closet Hoosier Club.
There we go.
Really, another event. Yeah, Indiana intellectuals.
Well, we have Theodore Dreiser, we have Booth Tarkin. We have some players, and we have James Whitcomb Riley. When I was
Ross Lockridge Jr.
Oh, that's more important. Yeah, I remember in 6th grade going on a pilgrimage to see James Whitcomb Riley's house. That was the level of our literary pilgrimages in Indiana. But I like what Laird said about Cather being a model for writers. A phrase I really liked in Ben's biography is when he described the what shall we call it, the odd structure of My Antonia, and he said it's a progress. He said it's not conventionally plotted, and he said it's a progress, quote, a progress of stories united by setting. And when I was writing my own progress of stories united by setting, a family memoir that has a lot about Indiana in it, as well as North Carolina and Japan and so on. Cather was more on my mind than any other writer or model, and especially the way My Antonia is put together in this sort of, and another story and another story and another story, but with that sort of linkage by setting, that meant and continues to mean a lot to me.
Death Comes for the Archbishop is another progress of stories.
Yeah, with its beginning in Rome and France, and it goes everywhere before it goes to New Mexico. Yeah. I just The Atlantic invited a bunch of critics, or crickets as Mark Twain called them, to help compile a list of the 100 greatest 20th century American novels, and they said name 5, and then they sort of went into the smoke-filled rooms and picked 100. But they asked me to write, Ben, about Death Comes for the Archbishop, which was one of the 2 novels I mentioned, that one and The Professor's House. And it was just mesmerizing to go back to that book. Then I mentioned it to a well-known critic I know who said, God, that's the worst book ever written. It's so static and awful. And ugh. So,
he said that about The Professor's House?
No, he said that about Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Oh.
You said you considered doing Death Comes for the Archbishop for our group, but you were afraid that it was too religious, or its religiosity would be.
I was a little nervous about just the level of religiosity, even though in all sorts of ways the religiosity of the 2 priests at the center of it's more like Wordsworth than it is like Thomas Aquinas. I mean, it's a very romantic sort of love of nature and landscape, and the conical hills that give this sort of geometric wonder to to New Mexico. We could have done it. I think we would have. I think we had more fun with My Antonia than we would have had with our 2 priests bravely setting up.
Can I bring in Cecilia? And if you can do the thing that brings more people in, I'd love to bring in Anthony Domestico, who writes constantly, or not enough ever for me, but almost as much as I would like him to, about fiction and literature for Book Post, and also often for the competitors over at Commonweal, and is a wonderful critic, and was kind enough to show up sometimes in our comments. And Dan Sofair, who's a poet I know from having published him in my magazine, Little Star. And Dan was just an extremely refined presence in our comments. So I wanted to give you a little hello, and to thank you both so much for chiming in. Do you have any questions or thoughts for Ben and Chris?
Oh, well, Anthony, do you want to?
No, you can go first. Yeah.
I wanted to just express my gratitude for this, and just the incredible level, how substantive this discussion has been, thanks to Chris. And I tried, I was walking through the park and I tried a podcast on Willa Cather, and I don't want to mention any names of whose podcast this was, but it literally took a half an hour for this person to even begin discussing Cather. It was just a rambling discussion. So I really that was just illustrated to me how substantive this discussion has been.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad it's satisfied. We need to come up with the next one, but I have a little time to work on it. Tony, has Cather been a writer that has been kind of a part of your worldview?
So first, I want to echo Dan and say thank you. The discussion was wonderful. The posts were wonderful. The conversation in the comments was wonderful as well. So no, I mean, I've read Cather, but she's never been one of my kind of lodestars. But I feel like she might be after this experience, and I commented a couple of times on how there were passages that reminded me of Marilyn Robinson, and that is in part because I'm always thinking of Marilyn Robinson. But there was one question I had for the both of you. I'd love to hear you respond. So there's an essay that Robinson wrote a few years ago, and she talked about how she was asked by someone how to distinguish people from the East and South from people in the West. And she said, people in the West use the word lonesome with a strongly positive connotation. And I was struck by how often that word lonesome came up in my Ántonia. And I'm just interested to hear you reflect a little bit on Cather as a writer of lonesomeness, generally, or my Ántonia specifically as a kind of novel about different kinds of experiences of lonesomeness.
You know, I would just make one point right off. Our narrator, Jim Burton, we find out in the prelude to the novel, we find out from the Cather-like narrator that he's unhappily married and presumably lonesome, and he is remembering and writing down his memories of a girl he loved, but theirs is a love that never took place. So in lieu of the great love, he's had this great literary project. They make an agreement that they're both going to sit down and write their memories of Cather, their memories of Ántonia Shimerda. But Ántonia Shimerda proves to be a more difficult subject for Cather than for Jim Burton. Cather is dilatory about it, doesn't write it down. She gives that task to Jim Burton, a man who, out of his success and loneliness, produces the text we're reading.
That's interesting.
Boy, that's a deep question, isn't it? Laird and I will have to put our heads together about our Indiana childhoods and think about the different loneliness of the.
Well, Ántonia says, right, that she was never lonely in the country, but she was lonely in the town.
Oh.
Yeah, I was going to go sort of in that direction, that urban loneliness and rural loneliness seem different. What we have so much of in my Ántonia is the companionship of prairie dogs and rattlesnakes and zigzag lightning in the sky and the red grass, and Jim seems to have a very crowded life in a way, a very if the natural description passages don't move you in my Ántonia, then it's a really long book. If you're moved by them, the book has a kind of effervescence and excitement to it. But I think we do feel that Jim comes west because he's lonely. And in that book 5, so peculiarly titled Cusack's Boys, in which Jim is just engulfed by Antonia's children, you feel that finally he's not so lonesome anymore, and he just wants to put all those boys in his back pocket and make them part of his life forever. Yeah.
At least for a day, he's enfolded into their family. He's one of them. And one of my favorite moments in the book is in that book 5, that scene where the boys say to Jim, "Why are you so good to us?" And he says, "You know why," meaning you must understand that I have loved your mother.
But Cather is also a great writer of urban alienation. Paul's Case is an absolutely classic story set in Pittsburgh and New York, with a young gay man who could not be lonelier in Pittsburgh than, than the most remote dugout in Nebraska.
Well, this gives me a chance to bring in Peter, who's in his car in like in Buffalo or something. I mean,
Rochester, but close enough. Yeah.
Do we pronounce your name Mylander?
Yes, that's right.
So Peter wrote an essay for the Bulwark about one of ours, Cather's World War I novel, which Ben is really interesting about in his book. And perhaps the loneliness theme arises here. But his essay, which was just like very recent, February 9th, invokes the notion of the antique virtues.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes, thanks, Anne. I don't want to. I mean, I heard just the tail end there of the conversation about loneliness. It does come into, I think, one of ours as well. I'm kind of curious what people think about Antonia's loneliness. I mean, she's got her family around her, but she does. I never got a chance to put something in the comments on the last book, but we had a lot of comments about Jim, and I also want to ask about Ántonia and what people think of her, because she sort of retreats into the past in her own way. I mean, she moves back to this farm. She's happy. She's got her family. But for me, the fact she doesn't speak English anymore is just awfully symbolic of a kind of frozenness in time. And Chris, you had in your very nice comments made that contrast between Ántonia living in the future, right, and Jim sort of in the past, which is sort of right, but she's in the past in her own way too. And maybe that's a kind of analog to the loneliness. I just trying to jump in on the loneliness theme there a little bit.
yeah, I felt like reading about that, like she'd almost created her own town. She'd recreated the town of her. She'd filled her world with people that would were enough to populate her environment. Laird has a comment in the comments, which Laird, you can say out loud. It's also interesting to consider Cather's relative aesthetic loneliness. Brilliant writing apart, as you've discussed, from her generation and how this moves into the work in different ways. That's a lovely observation.
Yeah, we may have overdone. I may have overdone Ántonia not being involved with the past. I think what you said is absolutely right. She's sort of populating her world of children with memories and ghosts, and the most moving moment like that is that Leo, the strangest of the most mercurial of the children, who Jim says he's really going to miss. Leo is a kind of ghost presence for Antonia's father, and when he plays the fiddle, when he plays Antonia's father's fiddle, that is this sort of magical summoning of the father's presence. Interestingly, her tie to the past is more to the ancestral. It's more to the old country path. It's her father's world, and so when they get the postcards from Prague and so on for Ántonia, it's like, let's get them framed and put them on the wall. And she tells the story of the rattlesnake and how heroic Jim killed the 5-foot or whatever it is, 9-foot, 50-foot rattlesnake that Jim killed long ago. But it is more this ancestral and sometimes a sort of aristocratic old country that she seems to summon through Leo and through other sort of divination that she.
Yes, it's quite a moment when Leo plays the violin. It's the past in the present in the past, and the reconciliation of each in terms of the other.
And another magical violin in one of ours. I mean, I think the violin, and then she takes Yehudi Menuhin under. Cather takes the child Yehudi Menuhin under her wing, and somehow the opera singers and the Bohemian or Jewish or old country violin for her did have this sort of magic to it. I mean, it does for all of us, doesn't it?
Yeah, but then Cusack, he was talking about this contemporary musician and was so interested in the state of her career and, was tempted in Vienna to just spend all his money having fun in the cabarets and dancing with the girls in town. So it's almost as though his music and Antonia's music are playing side by side, but they're two different sorts of music.
Yeah, that's beautifully said.
Tony, would you like to say what you just said?
Oh, sure. No, I think I was just responding to Laird in the previous conversation about Cather seeming strangely kind of out of step with her contemporaries, that in this read, I was actually struck by how modernist my Ántonia seemed in many ways. The kind of formal strangeness of the open frame that you were talking about beforehand, the way that the emphasis falls very differently from where you might expect in a story of this kind. Just reminded me, Woolf has this great essay, Modern Fiction, where she talks about Chekhov and how in Chekhov, the emphasis never falls where you'd expect it to fall, and it doesn't fall where it would in the kind of 18th or 19th century novel. And in that way, Cather actually struck me this time as quite experimental in her kind of structural decisions and kind of where she leans in and pulls back.
I was very aware of that in the parts where, like, after Antonia's father dies, suddenly, those scenes, like he has this beautiful Christmas scene, and meanwhile, the Shimerdas are like suffering in the snow, and we're not really hearing about them. These scenes are sort of side by side, and not you're not asked to have this kind of emotional continuity, which would seem more melodramatic. Like if we were more, yeah. Cecilia and Soleil, maybe we can take away the pins and be sort of more a gallery. And I'd like to point out that I wanted to ask if Abby Rosebrock is here. Abby, are you here? Oh, well, let's keep. Are all the pins going away?
Yeah, I'm here.
I wanted to single out Abby. Abby wrote a great piece for us about writing for the theater, and she is herself a playwright who has written a lot of roles about rural women. And I wondered if you had any kind of responses to Cather and Ántonia.
Oh, wow. I'm honored that you would even ask. Thanks. It's such a masterpiece. I just, to me, it's like the greatest, I don't know if this is like on the topic of rural women, but it's like the end of the novel is like the greatest expression of disappointment or of like the narrator's unhappy marriage and his sort of infatuation with my Ántonia and the fact that they are never an item. I think about it all the time, and how redemptive, like the quality of the prose in the novel just feels so redemptive. It's as if the heartbreak of that is like totally redeemed by this closely observed depiction of Ántonia herself. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but yeah, it also does. It feels like Dubliners in a way, like, which I think of as another work of prose fiction that just completely nails the goals of modernism and of like more 19th century realistic, the values of more earlier fiction. And that's all I have to say.
Well, what kind of reminded me, I just saw a reading of one of Abby's plays, and I was so struck that your characters are often sort of share with Ántonia this characteristic of maybe not necessarily having a full palette of intellectual parameters for expressing their ideas, but they have all of this intelligence, which is just kind of pounding through their lives.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's definitely how I would describe that character. And maybe that's a reason why the book was so formative for me. I remember it being presented in high school as like a great work of the Midwest or of the West. And I'm from the South.
That is different. I concede.
Sorry.
I concede that the South and the Midwest are not the same place.
No, but I always did feel like a special kinship with that character, and maybe that's why that like she definitely embodies a kind of intelligence that's not of like the urban mainstream, I guess.
So like we've got a bunch of other Michelle, who else have been our faithful commenters? Would any of you guys like to ask a question or say something about the reading? All right, I will suspend my attracting attention to commenters and invite anybody who wants to say something. Oh, Amanda, hello. There you are. How are you? Thank you for coming. Oh, you don't look muted, but I can't hear you.
Here's Amanda. She's muted.
I think you might be your it is your what do you call that thing? Your microphone off? Sometimes if you click on that little caret next to the microphone, it will. Maybe while you are searching for that, I will just mention that I saw
How's this?
great.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you I'm so happy to be here and to see everyone. And like others said, I was so grateful for this conversation, which is another great online reading group experience, which comes to seem like so immediate. And it's just been wonderful. I was thinking, since you asked, I was thinking about how you placed Cather with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and talked about Anthony talking about how modern the text seems and the emphasis falling where you don't expect it. I wondered if there was something like when you say Fitzgerald or Hemingway or Faulkner, like this immediate kind of impression of those writers' styles, if you will, like comes right up for me. But with Cather, it's a little more muted, and I'm wondering what it is like. Is there something like that comes to you when you think of Cather's writing in that same way that, you know, when you think of Hemingway, you're like, oh yes, you know, the short sentences, the, you know, everything like that. Is there something specifically about Cather that happens when you say she's my favorite of all those other writers? She's the one that is the most important to me. Sorry for that being so long.
Well, she has a lyricism that is entirely her own and sets her at odds with her younger contemporaries, I would say. Also, she really believed in ideals. She felt that ideals were what were most real in life, whereas her fellow writers from the 1920s wrote overwhelmingly about the illusoriness and deceptiveness of ideals. So that's a very stark difference in temperament to go along with the stark difference in style. Hemingway hated one of ours and wrote a angry, probably drunken letter to Edmund Wilson in which he says, I know where she got her war scenes from Birth of a Nation. Scene after scene is plagiarized directly out of Birth of a Nation. Willa Cather didn't go to the movie, so I don't think that's right. I don't think you can make that claim. I am a lover of one of ours. I think it's a beautiful book. And Hemingway says she had to get her war experience from somewhere. Well, you don't have to have had war experience to write a war novel. Stephen Crane is the proof of that. And I think that she was wary of her younger contemporaries. Those three writers, Faulkner and Fitzgerald and Hemingway, were young enough to be her sons, and yet she is measured against them because she's writing her best work in the 20s like them.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's the storyteller's voice. She's more interested in storytelling. She's more interested in stringing various storytellers together. She's really interested in unstable narration, which I think was one of the experimental aspects of My Ántonia that we explored, but it's also dominant in a brilliant short novel of Cather's, My Mortal Enemy. That word "my" again, My Mortal Enemy. You read this through and you have that same sense that you do with My Ántonia of, is this Jim's story, is this Antonia's story? With My Mortal Enemy, we have another strong voice narrator, Nellie Birdseye, perfect name for a narrator, and the woman who is going through her sort of crisis with her mortal enemy, and we get to the end of the book and we have no idea who the mortal enemy is. There's a wonderful ambiguity about the ending of the book, just as there is with so many of Cather's books. I mean, I don't know about you, Ben. I mean, I know you like the long story Come In Aphrodite, which I just love to death, of Cather's, a great New York story. But there's a conversation at the end, and I still don't know what one of the interlocutors says at the end, where the Aphrodite character asks a dealer, well, is he a really great artist, about the guy she's had a love affair with, and then they've broken up. And then she says, thanks. That's what I wanted to hear. What did he say? And it's not like an editor fell asleep or something and said, but Cather has, as in so many, and I think this is another thing, Amanda, that I love about her, that she doesn't look like she's trying hard to be modern. On the contrary, she's trying to pass as a traditional writer. But there are these just extraordinary surprises, bizarre sentence at the end of The Professor's House. I don't know, Ben, maybe you've memorized it, but it's sort of, he thought that he thought that he thought that. I mean, there's a very strange, convoluted sentence that he could face the Berengaria and the future, but it's very hard to sort out what the sentence actually.
Yes, it's true.
So I like the sort of cobbled together mini stories. Now we'll hear about Pavel and Peter in one voice, and now we'll hear about the Cutters in another voice, and now Ántonia will herself tell a story. The storytelling is so rich.
Someone has said in the comments, I thought the novel was incredibly modern about marriages and loneliness, but was struck by how visiting people has changed. That Jim just showed up for a weekend without notice is jarring to us. It made me wonder what is lost and gained by not ringing someone's doorbell unannounced. Would chapter 5 have worked in the same way if Ántonia knew Jim was coming?
I was raised in a world, Fort Worth, Texas, half a century ago, in which people did just still drop in on each other unannounced. And when I first got to New York, I tried this a few times and quickly realized that it's not done in New York. It's not done in big cities generally. But you're always supposed to be welcome in some settings. You're always supposed to be ready to welcome guests, and I guess that's what Red Cloud was like.
And could I pick up on a couple of those observations?
Anybody, please just come in.
Yeah. So as Anne knows, because when she was kind enough to invite me to join the group, I told her I'm no kind of Cather expert, and not even a literature scholar. I'm a political theorist. But I mean, one of the things that I have really appreciated about what I have read by Cather touches on some of the things that people were just commenting on. And it is exactly this sort of combination of the old and the new, the traditional and the modern. I mean, she is a mom in some ways, it seems to me, but has this deep appreciation for the past. Every time you think she's going to turn her back on the past, she goes back to it. Every time you think she's going to turn her back on the present, she's prepared to inhabit it. The characters in my Ántonia, for example, have just this wide variety of experiences and trajectories. Oh, am I cutting out on you there? Am I cutting out or am I still there?
I just think this is miraculous.
I'm being told my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if
we can hear you. Can
you can hear me. Okay. I'll finish it up then. I heard you say you could hear me at least. But just one of the books I have read by her is Shadows on the Rock, which I think is just one of the most Burkean books I've ever read in my life, with this appreciation of tradition, even though nothing happens in it really. And so for me, just this kind of back and forth between the past and the present. That line about the antique virtues that they stuck in the title of my essay was from Benjamin's book. One of the lines he quoted from her in his book. So I really appreciate. I'm not that interested in thinkers who only look backwards. And I'm not that interested in thinkers who entirely want to throw the past out. Right? It's that combination of appreciating what's valuable in the present that I always enjoy. I think Cather has a lot of that.
Oh, Chris, what's he talking about? Come here.
Yeah, well, and Jim actually says basically that there's nothing, that all of value in life is hanging on to the past. But I don't think that we're asked to believe him.
That last sentence really sums it up. It's such a powerful last sentence. I wonder if she didn't have it in her pocket as she was writing. Whatever we had missed, we possessed together, the precious, the incommunicable past.
But isn't that a problem? Because he's just written about it. I mean, it's incommunicable, but he's written a whole book about it. So.
Yes, it's true.
I want to say hi to my old friend Megan Marshall and welcome her to the gathering. Yeah, I like the idea of that last sentence in the pocket. I compared it in our conversations, our online conversations, to the last line of The Great Gatsby that also has that sort of pre-made, so we beat on boats against the current, ceaselessly borne back into the past. That it's got another sort of, we're in the past, but it is sort of separated off a little bit from the novel that has come before.
Yeah.
Fitzgerald wrote Cather a letter in which he says, "I fear I may have plagiarized something from a lost lady in the figure of Marion Forster, and I feel I may have given a trait of hers to Daisy Buchanan." And Cather wrote back saying, don't give it another thought, young man. And it's obvious that she admired The Great Gatsby. She also admired at least one book I know of by Hemingway, Death in the Afternoon. But she was obviously much too young to be influenced by these writers. They were, as I say, young enough to be her sons. And she kept her distance from everyone. I've often wondered if she read Edith Wharton. There's not much evidence that she did, and the two never met. They would never have had occasion to meet. But I'll hold it there.
And for all the people of that generation to choose, she chooses Sarah Orne Jewett as her sort of public godmother, who tells her, tells her don't use male narrators, tells her, don't write historical fiction, all the things that she proceeds to do. But Sarah Orne Jewett is just a tremendous writer.
And
that's incredible stories, and in the just ungodly beautiful Country of the Pointed Firs.
The Country of the Pointed Firs is the most palpable influence on Cather, definitely.
Completely agree.
There are these great comments in the chat, and I don't know, maybe everybody gets to see them. So we don't need to bring them in, but probably Chris and Ben aren't seeing them. So Laird mentioned an essay by John Barth called The Literature of Replenishment about postmodern endeavor. But it might be interesting in the context of Cather too, drawing on the 19th century and earlier, and also living fiercely in the concerns of the 20th. We'll add that to our list. And then we got a long comment from Major Jackson. Hi, Major. I don't, should I just read this? Would you like to read it? He said, happy to stumble on the conversation. One year, maybe age 20, I took up Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Cather's My Ántonia, and Flaubert's Madame Bovary. Cather's novel seared itself most because of the natural descriptions. I was happy to visit Nebraska years ago with the rich feeling of Cather's prose in me. I cannot think of the triumph and tragedy of these characters without thinking of the land. I think that's so true. Could the panel speak to how these books, if not My Ántonia, reinscribes or mythologizes place in the wake of women's interior lives?
Interesting.
Is he still here? I don't know. Anyway,
Yes.
thank you for that lovely, which I rushed through.
I,
You can reflect on it in the chat.
I'd like to pose a question to the group. Is there any other novel that anyone can think of in which a woman delivers her own baby? That is a truly extraordinary thing in My Ántonia. She goes upstairs, she corrals the animals, she goes upstairs, closes the door, delivers her own baby without making a sound.
Major Jackson says in Beloved, someone,
is that right? Aha. Interesting.
Toni Morrison, who is a highly sophisticated reader of Willa Cather, and especially of Cather's last book, Sapphire and the Slave Girl.
Thank you, Major Jackson.
yeah, to me, there was a slight, I don't know, maybe it's maybe not too important to dwell on it, but there was some unreality about that. Like, if you have the capability to deliver your own baby without problems, you know, that's lucky. But it doesn't necessarily cast you. There's something, yeah.
The detail that she's just taken care of the cattle and then sort of locks the door on the cattle that she's just herded down from the plains, and then, oh, and another thing, goes to the room, shuts the door, deal with the baby, and that go out. Yeah, it does have a kind of a sort of dream aspect to it, but talk about loneliness, you know. The moment you would think that she would most want people around her to help her.
Oh, I had wanted to bring up Ken Yim was here and now he's gone, and he's the one who called our attention to the fact that the film Minari was based on My Ántonia, which is like a modern immigrant story.
Oh, I've never heard about Minari.
I believe it's about a Korean family in the Midwest.
Yes, who take up farming, even though it's not a part of their past. Yeah.
And then we also had this other Korean movie
Past
by
Lives.
Celine Song, which had its other completely different set of really relevant resonances. Which, Dan, you brought that to us.
Yes, the relevance of that to me was just the power of attachment between very young people, and how it doesn't have to be about much, you know. And you see how in Past Lives they might we just see them at 10 years old or so, about the same age, and they're joking about, oh, you got a better grade on the exam than me this time. What's that all about? And or should we turn this way on the path, or should we turn this way? And we just catch a glimpse of this intimacy between them, but there's really no, you know, there's nothing that would look like something substantive to an adult, but that is a really important point, because when we meet this woman 20 years later, she's those moments have a curious power. And similarly, for Jim and Ántonia, there's these times when Ántonia maybe just reached out a hand as an emblem of attachment, reached out a hand to Jim. I was saying that's everything, that's kind of the absolute of the novel. I mean, that's just to throw that out there. It made me think of past lives, that attachment factor.
I love that connection, and I hope it wins Best Picture, knowing it won't, of course, tonight. But another, I mean, when Dan mentioned this, I thought, oh my God, of course. I had seen it the night before, and I hadn't really made the connection. And then Dan says, ding. But in both cases, the grown-up versions, the women have moved on. They're still very excited to have the male visitor who sort of drops in from Seoul or drops in from New York, but they've moved on in very important ways, and the guys are sort of in the Gatsby. Can't repeat the past. What do you mean you can't repeat the past? They're like we're all in. Come on, come with me.
Isn't it? It seems interesting that both Jim and Ántonia are brought to that place, and I think at the beginning that kind of goes by sort of quickly, but they're both brought there. Jim's an orphan, and what Dan was saying about their sort of bonding, I feel like they both bond through this kind of grief almost that sort of does carry through the book in various ways. And then of course, Ántonia, Mr. Shimerda commits suicide. And so I feel like she's like in a grief mode through the whole book. And for me, it sort of undermined any possibility that they were going to get together, romantically, because they both seemed like they were like grieving and like drawn to each other through something that wasn't, romance or, physical attraction or whatever.
Yeah, that's interesting, as though death could be a kind of barrier to romantic connection. It reminds me of the Cossacks, Tolstoy's Cossacks, which has maybe some other parallels, and we know how much Cather loved Tolstoy. And there's this, he embarks on this. He has a terrible crush on one of the Cossack women, but then some sort of battle occurs, and she says, Cossacks have died, and that forms a kind of the limit of the connection he can make. Although I'm not totally sure. I don't know. But I like your point even more about that. It might seem that their attachment is limited to the two of them, but in fact there are many other forces, and the train ride conveys that from the very beginning. And Mr. Shimerda's agency saying, "Teach my Ántonia," wanting her. He's involved in her language acquisition. There's a kind of a triangle there. And the more you read the book, the more you appreciate the minor characters like Otto Fuchs and
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I like the widow Seaver as kind of another version of the capable woman who sort of mastered the art of the household.
Yeah.
And she too is on her own, and kind of provides this bridge. He can't just go see Ántonia himself. He has to be filled in on her story by this other person. I feel as though, but maybe I'm just being sentimental, that there was a moment in there where Ántonia needed him. He could have rescued her from ignominy. She was alone with a child. She had no money. And the fact that he doesn't even audibly consider, for our ears, when he's thinking about what happened there, the possibility that he could be helping her out, I found mysterious in a way that was interesting. I don't think it's a mistake in the book. I feel like it's very intentional, that as in, there's a moment in Past Lives where the woman sort of goes to him and she's kind of saying, he's saying like, yeah, no, I'm not really going to New York because it doesn't fit into my work schedule. And she's kind of like, and the story doesn't answer this question, you know. It leaves this big mystery. And I also think there's a mystery at the end about whether or not he's genuine about staying in touch with the family. Because he has these moments of kind of intense connection to Ántonia, and then he just wanders off and doesn't see her for 20 years or whatever.
I mean, so what shall I do?
Well,
Yeah,
thanks.
Amanda's point is sticking with me. I think it is one reason why we sometimes describe the book as being elegiac, that it feels, and this also comes back to the lyricism that Ben was talking about. The book is structured around deaths. It may end at the father's grave. The last section does begin with burying a beloved dog. I'm just thinking that the professor's house is also structured around a death in a very bold experimental decision. Cather has the voice of the dead man, dead in World War I, give an account of his ecstatic time in the cliff cities in Mesa Verde. But he's dead, and the book is structured around the loss of this magnetic figure, Tom Outland. We know his fiance, we know his favorite professor, we know, but it is this mourning that is sort of, you know, I taught for 35 years at a college where the founder's grave is in the middle of campus. You know, Mary Lyon is buried in the middle of the Mount Holyoke campus. So these sort of structuring things around deaths, it's an interesting structural decision.
Chris, have you now retired, Chris?
I have, yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Well, everybody, we're beginning to lose people. Laird has just left us. He's at a conference in Tucson, and he's going to go talk about Cather at a panel on the American short story.
Oh.
The discussion continues. Does anyone have any last parting thoughts or questions?
I would hate to leave it only on that note of grief and elegy, though. Neither Ántonia nor Jim seems unhappy when the book ends. She seems happy. We're told in the introduction that Jim keeps going back out west and is always happy to meet people with bold new ideas and support them and get them started and is excited about it. I mean, he seems to be happy to meet folks who want to do things out in the land where he came from. And I know, and you raised the doubt, but I read those comments in the introduction as indicating that he has been going back repeatedly. So I think I wrote one of my comments online, and I think it's a very bittersweet novel. But I would hate to just end with the with the note of grief as the only thing we have at the conclusion.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I feel like there are two things that he draws on and also the prose draws on in ways that, you know, we really experience it moving out of the book, which is this kind of incredible vitality and radiance of her presence, and also the radiance and depth of his natural description. It's like all he has to do is step outside of the town and just the hills and the grass and the sky kind of lift him up.
Thank you, Anne.
Well, thank you everyone so much. I hope we can do this again soon, and you've all made it so special and magical by being here. And huge thanks to Chris and Ben for making this happen.
Thank you. Lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope I'll see you all again soon at other book post occasions.
You.
Have a lovely. Thank you, Grace. I'm glad you made it on.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you both so much.
Bye, Michelle. Thank you so much for being a part of the comments.
Thank you very much.
Who else do I
Thank you,
recognize here?
Thanks, everyone. That was awesome.
And Peter, like, you're a hero. I really appreciate you managing to call in.
Well, thank you for inviting me in. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for ending things on a positive. Yeah.
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 And
Nice
thank you.
to meet you, Dan.
Yeah, and thanks for writing
Great
about literature, even though one could just think about politics all the time these days.
Well, we political theorists like to claim that everything has to do with politics at some point. So
Not easily escaped from. Okay, have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.